50% of the violent crimes committed in districts occupied by Mexicans, Greeks, Turks, Filipinos, Spaniards, Latin Americans, and Negroes may be traced to the use of marijuana. If the hideous monster Frankenstein came face to face with the monster marijuana, he would drop dead of fright. Harry J. Anslinger.
To learn more and to obtain a free copy of the informational booklet, Marijuana, It's Time for a Conversation, please visit marijuanaconversation.org. During the hearings before Congress on the Marijuana Tax Act, the lone dissenting voice was Dr. William Woodward of the American Medical Association. Dr. Woodward pointed out that all of Anslinger's testimony was based on hearsay and exaggerated newspaper editorials, and that Congress had not been presented one single shred of actual evidence of marijuana's supposed dangers. Harry Anslinger remained head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics from 1930 until 1962.
And in those 30 years, he was pretty busy building up his bureaucracy, primarily because he wanted to protect the jobs of all of the alcohol prohibition agents who no longer had work to do after alcohol prohibition was repealed. So a lot of his anti-marijuana propaganda was designed to make sure that there would be full employment for them.
You know, and ironically, even though he's building that bureaucracy all that time and starting to put into place these very harsh penalties and harsh sentences, the popularity of marijuana was continuing to grow, especially in the 60s, when it all of a sudden became a political symbol for unrest and civil disobedience.
So how does Nixon react? His popularity is slipping. He's got people parading in the streets about the war. So he drops one war, takes up a new one.
That's right. In 1970, President Nixon appointed a blue-ribbon panel to study the impact of marijuana on our society. It was commonly known as the Schaefer Commission, named after the Republican governor of Pennsylvania who chaired the panel. But the Schaefer Commission made some unexpected recommendations.
Oh, there is a commission that is supposed to make recommendations to me about this subject.
It became apparent how little was really known about the effects of this drug and how little evidence there was to support the claims about its dangers. The way that we framed it was that there was no current evidence that occasional use, moderate use, which some we called recreational use, of marijuana by basically psychologically healthy people was harmful.
The recommendation of the Commission in its first report is that we do not feel that private use or private possession in one's own home should have the stigma of criminalization, that people who experiment should not be criminalized for that particular behavior.
Eventually, we had endorsements from the American Bar Association, from the American Medical Association, from the American Public Health Association, the National Education Association. I'm sure there were many, many others. But mainstream institutions in American society said, yes, this is the right way to go about dealing with this problem. And eventually, over the period from 1973 to 1977, you had 12 states that actually did adopt the Commission's recommendation and decriminalized.
President Nixon just wasn't happy with the Schaefer Commission's findings.
No, he wasn't, because he had appointed a number of conservatives to the commission, expecting that they would give him information that would justify his calling for a war on drugs. But instead, they came back and recommended decriminalizing marijuana. He did not expect that, nor did he expect that so many of the country's experts and professional associations would agree with that recommendation.
I think we have a question from our audience. Yeah.
Yes, exactly what does decriminalization mean?
The term decriminalization typically means that you don't get arrested, you don't wind up with any sort of criminal record. And in some states there can be no penalty whatsoever for the private possession of small amounts of marijuana by adults. In other states you might have to pay a civil fine like you would for a parking ticket.
You know, there was a prior study back in 1938. Mayor LaGuardia of New York commissioned this study on marijuana because he had been acquainted with an Army study while he was in the House of Representatives. And in 1944, that study was published saying that, in fact, marijuana was a relatively harmless substance.
So twice in recent history, back in the 40s and then with Nixon, politicians have taken information and discarded it and put out false information on marijuana to further their political needs. What happens to the legal system when something like this goes on?
Well, the result is a loss of respect for the law.
In the 1980s, "just say no" became the new phrase of an old propaganda campaign. But it wasn't just Republicans beating the drum of war. In 1986, Speaker of the House Tip O'Neill, a Democrat, saw getting tough on crime as a means for his party to win the upcoming elections.
In the 1980s, I was the attorney in the U.S. House of Representatives, principally responsible for writing the drug laws. In the only time in my 10 years at the House of Representatives, we had a bill that we were considering that had never been introduced. There were no hearings. There was no expert input from the Justice Department, from the federal judges, from the Bureau of Prisons. We were literally flying blind. And this legislation ended up creating long mandatory minimums of 10 years mandatory up to life imprisonment when the prior maximum had been 20 years. To say that you deserve up to a year in prison to possess marijuana, that is, to possess it for the purpose of using it, is preposterous. It's totally unjust. How these sentences get imposed is completely random on one hand, and on the other is very much related to what your social class or race is. These laws fundamentally fail the test of justice. As I look back on it, as 30 years as a lawyer, this has been, if this were intentional, this would be the most shameful thing I could imagine somebody doing as a lawyer. It's terrible. It's terrible to live with. That's why, it's critically important, I think, that people like me speak out and say, these laws are wrong, they're counterproductive, they're unjust.
I live in a state that passed a medical marijuana law in the late 90s. My partner and I care for people living with AIDS, and part of that care is providing them with marijuana. Having a warrant served is one of the scariest things that I've ever experienced. Having the battering ram at the door at dawn, jumping out of bed, opening the door, seeing the police there, swarming into the house, handcuffing us while we watch them tear our house apart. We live in fear of losing everything again.
I was in my last year of law school and I was convicted of a federal marijuana felony. I had to plead guilty in a plea bargain. I had a house arrest sentence and 5 years probation. I will not be able to run for public office. I have 2 wonderful kids. I will need to explain to them why I can't vote for the rest of my life, why we can't cross the border. I feel like I have a brand for the rest of my life, and I can't get rid of it.
I spent 26 years in the New Jersey State Police. 14 of those years I was undercover in narcotics. As a former police officer, I believe that the prohibition of marijuana is one of the most ridiculous abuses of our allocation of police staff and money that we could possibly have. We could be allocating our resources toward protecting folks from violent criminals, from child molesters, from drunk drivers, people who are going to kill people. People who are using marijuana are not violent people. Ask any cop whether they would rather go on a call where they know people are high on marijuana or whether they would rather go on a call where people are high on alcohol.